Afternoon. It was a little broken up there, but is the sound okay and the visual okay? Okay. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, number one, for your lovely introduction, and also to Lauren and the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Minnesota, and also to Isidro Rivera and the Spanish Department at the University of Kansas. These two institutions are essential to maintaining vibrant programming in the humanities today, at a time when, let's face it, the humanities are taking a beating. After that capital attack on January 6th, Andrew Del Banco reminded us that the only protection against demagoguery is education, not ideological indoctrination, not technical training, but humane education that helps people grasp the experience of others different from themselves. In short, the humanities are not a luxury. They are a desperate necessity. So I begin with this reminder to say that I'm humbled to be part of your efforts of keeping alive the study of medieval and early modern Iberia and its value to all of us today. So as we begin, and because we're on Zoom, I'm going to ask in my presentation today 4 questions kind of sprinkled throughout for people attending to write down the answers to. And or just keep in your head if you don't have access to paper or some note-taking app. So question number 1, and as we get started, what's your favorite food? Just jot that down before we get going, and don't take too much time to think about it. It's kind of like the first thing that pops into your head. Okay, so let's begin. To understand the evolution of Spanish gastronomy, scholars have turned to historical texts that include legal documents, political essays, travel logs, and especially cooking manuals. Together with fictional narratives, plays, and poems, these primary documents provide cultural context for specific time periods that include foodstuffs, modes of production and consumption, and insight into the political, economics, and social forces that both define food and are defined by it. Apart from general historic overviews, recent scholarship has focused on internal perspectives on Spanish fare to explore elements of Jewish and Arab heritage, class and food of the elite, regional foods, individual foodstuffs, and food representations in specific texts and/or authors, to name the most salient perspectives. Additionally, several impressive volumes of collected essays, such as Forging Communities, take an interdisciplinary approach to the study of food, and in the process, enhance how scholars can understand historical developments and cultural continuities through multiple vantage points and through time and space. Scholars have also produced impressive editions of the earliest cooking manuals from the 13th century, like these 2 Hispano-Muslim manuscripts, the anonymous Kitab al-Tabiq and Ibn Racin's Fudarat. Books written in the 14th century, like the Catalan Saint-Sauvy, and here we see a recent edition in Catalan and also in English. To the collection of recipes written at the Portuguese court, here the O Livro de Cocina, Infanta Doña Maria de Portugal, and the Castilian court with Enrique Villena's Arte Cesoria. This latter one provides excellent information both on food presentation at the table and an excellent food catalog that includes 30 different fowl, 24 quadrupeds, fish and shellfish, reptiles, types of fruits, vegetables, herbs, and spices. Apart from these works that focus primarily at court, others include cooking manuals from the university, like Domingo Hernández de Macera's Libro del Arte de Cocina, or privileged households like the Manual de Mujeres, and with the university one that takes us into the 17th century. So foodstuffs from these primary sources serve as connectors between time periods and regions, as they link food from food items in earlier works with those in later works, and in some cases provide evidence for shifts in changing tastes. In this talk this afternoon, I'd like to consider the legacy of medieval culinary traditions of the Iberian Peninsula through the lens of 2 specific early modern cookbooks, and the way that Spanish food is perceived by cookbook writings beyond the Iberian Peninsula. I'll begin then with a brief discussion of the concept of nation and national consciousness to contextualize the 2 most important court cookbooks of the early modern period. And then in part one of the talk, we'll dig into Maître Robert's Livre de Coque from 1520, which was translated 5 years later into Castilian, the Libro de Cocina or Libro de Guisados. And it's at this time the author is given the name Ruperto de Nola. That's how people know him today primarily. And early images of Spanish cuisine from beyond Spain's border. And then in part two, we'll turn to Francisco Martinez Montiño's book, Arte de Cocina, Pastelería, Bizcochería, Conservería, and visions of other European cooks and gastronomes' use of the olla podrida specifically to define Spanish cooking. Using cookbooks and journals from other parts of Europe, my goals are to convey how different European cooks and gastronomes identify and describe Spanish cuisine, and to enhance our understanding of the evolution of Spanish cuisine, looking back to the Middle Ages, focusing on the 16th and 17th centuries, and offering comparative perspectives, both from inside Spain and from without. So if you can, during this talk, take time to consider flavors, and also, as much as possible, engage your other senses to visualize the dishes and feel the textures that are often described with the recipes. Across Europe, one of the clear distinctions between the early modern period and the Middle Ages is the development of national cuisines. Cookbooks both at court and within aristocratic circles proliferate. Palace cooks are no longer anonymous figures, but well known by their reputations. And in their writings, these culinary artists begin to emphasize both regional and national dishes. Cooks such as Maître Ruperto de Nola, and Francisco Martinez Montiño lay the foundation for court cooking of the Iberian Peninsula. From these manuals, we get a clear view of the early foundations of Spanish food consumed by the elite. But rarely are recipes defined as a la Española or a la Catalana in these works. Rather, we must turn to cooking manuals from beyond Spain's borders, for example, by Bartolomeo Scapi or Gervais Markham or Pierre de Lune, for evidence of how Europeans understood Spanish cuisine. Historians often refer to the year 1800 as the Great Divide that marks a radical shift in how time, society, and nation are understood. Critics such as Benedict Anderson, Ernest Gellner, Eric Hobsbawm, and others argue that national consciousness was essentially a 19th century phenomenon. For these critics, and particularly Gellner, the aristocratic elite belonged to a larger community than nation and spoke other national languages, while the peasantry belonged to a smaller one, the region or even village, and communicated in local dialect. Universal education fostered national consciousness, and other industrialized indicators like railroads or newspapers, urbanization, for example, also fostered that shift. But according to Burke, this great divide doesn't take into account distinctions between social and political nationalism and a broader sentiment of national pride. Burke argues that critical reactions point to a standardization of languages that began much earlier. And in the case of Spain, this is certainly true, as attention to the national language is apparent with the publication of Nebrija's 1492 Gramática de la Lengua Castellana, the first book dedicated to a grammar of a modern European language, and later in the early 17th century with Sebastián de Covarrubias' 1611 Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana o Española, the first vernacular monolingual dictionary in Europe. So in terms of language, national consciousness was very much on the mind of those seeking to codify Spanish grammar and lexicon. And I would argue that in the realm of the gastronomic arts, something similar is occurring as national identities are tied in the names of specific recipes found in the earliest printed cookbooks. So noted author Alberto Capati called dishes that are anchored to a specific place gastrotoponyms. Gastrotoponyms. Recipes whose titles indicate a specific geographic source provide evidence that an author or a compiler was not only aware of foreign tastes and gastronomic customs, but also privileged them by including them in a particular work. These recipes indicate both a sense of national consciousness and an openness to external taste. Their appearance in cookbooks shows a willingness to acknowledge and embrace external modes of preparation and provide for readers, both cooks and those for whom the recipes are created, an understanding of another foreign cuisine. At first, gastrotoponomic recipes quite simply identified a different approach to the dish without any clear indication of what foodstuffs or cooking methods linked it to a particular place. We find examples of this approach in the early part of the 15th century and throughout the early modern period. But beginning in the 16th century, specific dishes are attached to a national cuisine with more intentionality, as they often include a brief comment related to the recipe's place of origin. In the case of Spain, the olla podrida, the hodgepodge stew, serves as an excellent example of how dishes come to represent the external vision of what another national cuisine is. Okay, so we're at the part one on Nola and the 16th century perspectives. And here's my second question for y'all to jot down. If you had to define your national cuisine, what dish or food item would you select and why? So as you're meditating on that, we're going to continue. At the dawn of the 16th century, our understanding of taste and food habits primarily concerned nobility and aristocracy. From professional cooks who served the elite prior to the early modern period, some 100 manuscripts have been identified. One of the earliest available today is the Catalan Sansovit. In this work of 72 recipes, there are no references to a national or regional designation. But a century later, of the 66 recipes that make up the French manuscript Vivandier, 3 references to nations occur: a German meat broth, a English broth, and a Hungarian broth. And in the more extensive anonymous Neapolitan recipe collection from the second half of the 15th century, many more national and regional references. Some 10% of the 220 recipes form part of the titles. The author includes 16 references to Italy and states located within the Italian peninsula, and the second most frequent designation are 4 Catalan-style recipes, as well as 1 Aragonese, and the first ever reference to a Spanish mode of production with the Spanish squid sauce. We can see then that even during the latter half of the 15th century, an awareness of food preparation based on geographic distinction, those gastrotoponyms, increasingly informed different cooking manuals, although none of these recipes mark a definitive style of cooking attached to the region. I'll also add as a side note, in the Hispano-Muslim tradition, like those 13th century manuscripts that I mentioned earlier, it is common to include gastrotoponymic recipes and even credit other cooks for the recipes or the person for whom the recipe was made. So this is the case, and I'll just say one, but there are many, of ternera asada que se hacía para el Sayyid Abul Ala in Ceuta. So he was the governor and admiral of Ceuta and the son of the Almohad Caliph Yusuf I. But other geographic references include the Andalusian town of Niebla, Cordoba, the Algerian city Boukhia, today's Bijaya, and bigger areas like Tunisia, Persia, and simply the East, right? Dishes from the East. So turning to Spanish cuisine as represented in the cookbooks of Maître Robert, Nola, and Martinez Montiño, we can trace how it evolves over an almost 100-year trajectory and how these authors privilege specific dishes. So to be clear, Maître Robert had little, if nothing, to do with the Castilian court. Rather, his life centered on Aragon and Naples. But his cookbook, Llibre de Coc, was quickly translated into Castilian, edited several times in both Catalan and Castilian, and laid the groundwork for Christian court cuisine of the Iberian Peninsula. Not much is known about his life, but most critics agree that he was either Catalan-born or Catalan parents that relocated to Naples, and he served under Don Ferrante, the illegitimate son of Alfonso I, Alfonso V of Aragon, who ruled Naples between 1458 and 1494. In Nola's, or Maître Robert's Livre de Coq, he writes with pride about the 3 most important dishes in his collection. We'll just take a look at that. He says, debéis saber de cuántos manjares hay en el mundo, son la flor estas 3 y más principales, y son estas: salsa de pavo, mirauste, y manjar blanco. All 3 of these recipes are poultry dishes, whether it be peacock, capon, or hen in the first case, squab in the second, or hen in the third. All 3 also use ground almonds and either bread in the first and the third, or rice flour in the second, and includes cinnamon and sugar like the first two, or just sugar like the third one does. It comes as no surprise that his most valued recipes are made from poultry, because it was the privileged meat among the aristocracy, nor that they include nuts, flowers, and spices, as these items are so popular not only in Spain but throughout Europe, right, in different recipes. In Platina's On Right and On Right Pleasure and Good Health, and I'll note here that this is the first cookbook printed in Europe, 1465, and includes recipes from Martino da Como's Libro de Arte Cucinaria. The recipe Catalan Mirauste, like this, right? Catalan Mirauste in the Italian work, begins with words of praise for the Catalan people and their level of cooking expertise. And so this is how Platina opens that recipe. He says, the Catalan race, which is indeed distinguished and considered not much different in talent and physical form from the Italian level of skill, prepare a dish which they call mirauste in this way. I remember having eaten nothing more pleasant. Platina also includes Catalan blancmange, a Catalan dish for partridge, and again praises their cuisine. In both the Catalan cookbook and the Italian ones that reference Catalan cooking, there are no specific indicators that define a particular style or specific ingredients, but they do carry Catalan or Spanish label, and they seem to simply acknowledge their existence and pay homage to the way different nations prepare a dish. In addition to his top 3, Nola's collection is filled with dozens of sauce recipes, a handful of mirauste and blancmange recipes, many soups, stews, and one-pot meals, fish, meat, and vegetable dishes, pies, both savory and sweet, desserts and sweet fruit recipes, dishes for abstinence and partial abstinence days, and dishes for the ill. Nola's cookbook serves as a model for future writers and signals the directions that cookbooks will take. Like Miguel de Cervantes, with his publication of Don Quixote over a century later, the work contains a modern sensibility. In his introduction, Nola highlights the valued position of the cook and that cooking is a culinary art. Among his many stew recipes, we find potaje moderno, another otro potaje moderno, that reveal Nola's awareness of changes to cooking styles and ingredients. Similar to the Italian Nuova Cucina movement reflected in the Neapolitan recipe collection, Nola's work emphasizes regional and international cooking, and in doing so aids in the development of a distinct national style. The work contains regional Aragonese, Genoese, and Venetian recipes like toronjas, de jativa, que son almojábanas, rosquilla, de fruta, que llaman casquetas in Valencia and Barcelona, torta a la genovesa, and hijaneya a la veneziana. The recipes for Venetian jujubes is actually a broth with pasta. The pasta is made with cheese, fine breadcrumbs, eggs, saffron, and other herbs, and pressed through a large grater that form the dough into like gnocchi-sized shapes that and then are served in a broth. The hijaneya is a variant of guinja, a synonym of asufaifa or jujube, that red teardrop-shaped fruit of the jujube tree. Thus, the title of the dish, like the previous cheese fritter recipe in the shape of toronjas, or so many other recipes in the text, reflect its form, a visual image, rather than its content. Like its Italian counterparts, Libro de Coq also contains 2 recipes that signal specifically Catalan dishes. The fruta llamada robiolas a la catalana is a sweet fried dough recipe made with, in this version, so not the picture we're seeing, but made with rosewater batter, mixed with a hazelnut, pine nut, egg yolk mixture, and seasoned with cinnamon, sugar, ginger, and more rose water. After they are fried, they're sprinkled with rose water, honey, cinnamon, and sugar. This recipe, and this is the picture that you're seeing here, has evolved today into rubiols, a Holy Week turnover famous in Mallorca. The second Catalan dish is frutas llamadas garbias a la catalana. Here, borage and Swiss chard are cooked, drained, and chopped up with a soft cheese, kind of like ricotta. Egg yolk is added as well as more soft cheese, and this mixture is then used as a filling for turnovers, which are deep fried and sprinkled with rose water, honey, cinnamon, and sugar. In these Catalan recipes, as well as those designated Catalan in the Neapolitan recipe collection, the authors recognize the idea of a Catalan cuisine, even though specific definitive features have not yet taken shape. Nola also underscores the contributions of other cultures, specifically Arabic, in the development of Spanish gastronomy. He references several food items and dishes that are inspired by Arabic culinary traditions found throughout Spain and that form part of the country's heritage. 3 recipes, and you can see them here: the potaje de culantro llamado primo, the salsa granada. I'm sorry, there's 3 different recipes for the potaje de culantro llamado primo. In addition, salsa granada, berenjenas a la morisca, y calabazas a la morisca. The salsa granada recipe is for a chicken liver puree, thickened with egg yolk and flavored with orange juice and spices. It had previously appeared in the Catalan manuscript Saint-Sauvy, but in Nola's, now I'm going to switch over to Castilian, Libro de Cocina, he omits all references to tocino, of which there are no less than 4 appear in the Saint-Sauvy version. So, you know, I have to think if he's being a little sensitive to the Muslim traditions that it came from. Comparing the 2 a la morisca recipes, it is possible that the label refers to a finishing style that may be, you know, that both recipes share with finely grated cheese, ground spices that may include coriander, cumin, and/or caraway, and a whipped egg batter. But even the toronjas de jativa that were mentioned earlier show the Muslim influence in the recipe's second name, almojábanas, which comes from the Hispanic Arabic almugabana, meaning made with cheese, which comes from the classical Arabic gubn, which means cheese. Before the 1611 publication of Martinez Montiño's Arte de Cocina, the premier Italian cooking manual, Opera dell'arte del cucinare, written by Bartolomeo Scappi, was published in 1570, about the time of the author's death. This opus is nothing short of a masterpiece, and really, check this cookbook out. It's fabulous. Nothing short of a masterpiece of the early modern kitchen, and takes an innovative approach in treating Spanish food. Scappi's 6-volume work contains over 1,000 recipes divided into sections on meat, fowl, fish, pasta, diets for the infirm and convalescent, and recipes for Lent, and 28 just remarkable illustrations. Scappi cooked for 5 different popes and was private cook to Pius V. He also prepared meals for the conclave that chose Julius III as successor to Paul III, and was responsible for the coronation feast of Carlos V of the Holy Roman Empire, Carlos I de España, in Bologna in 1536. They say over 780 dishes were prepared. Scappi's love of his art form is apparent from the opening pages as he passionately describes food and commits to the smallest details. Before entering into a formal discussion of creating a dish, he highlights seasonal ingredients and how to recognize good quality. He incorporates vivid descriptions of cooking techniques and is very particular about how to present food. His tone, consistently positive. And as a closing for many recipes, he offers variations to accommodate changing seasons and different tastes. Like the earlier cooking manual, Scappi includes references to regional dishes: Venetian, Roman, Milanese, Lombardian, Neapolitan, Genovese, Sardinians, Sienese, and recipes with titles that include nationality, for example, to stew an ox loin in the German fashion, or to cook pike in a pottage in the French fashion. But as with earlier cooking manuals, these recipes don't really give an indication of, what the French fashion or German fashion exactly is or means. However, his treatment of another national food is groundbreaking in that he cites specific ingredients from specific countries. So he'll have, for example, salted salmon from Flanders, or salted head cabbage from Germany, fowl tongue from Cyprus, wine from Greece, and francolins and honey from Spain. The act of citing an ingredient from a specific region or nation, and he also includes like Milanese almonds, Roman cherries, Neapolitan mostaccioli, implies an excellence in the quality of that product and reflects a modern sensibility of discriminating value. In the case of Spain, Scapi singles out francolin that are brought to Italy in the recipe to spit roast and otherwise cook rock partridge, old common gray partridge, and francolin. He clarifies the size of birds worthy of import. He says, francolins brought from Sicily and Spain to Rome are the same size as rock partridges and have a grayish plumage. And in his recipe to prepare jelly from wether's feet, he again highlights Spanish offerings when he specifically calls for 2.5 ounces of Spanish honey to be combined with the other ingredients. Scapi shows his pioneering spirit when he includes recipes unique to 2 specific countries. One is to prepare a thick milk, popularly called Hungarian soup, and the second is to prepare a dish of various ingredients called in Spanish olla podrida. What Calderón would later dub La Princesa de los Guisados, the olla podrida was a fashionable dish during the Habsburg monarchy. In fact, Gómez Laguna speculates that Scapi became aware of this stew when he prepared the banquet for Carlos V's coronation feast. In 17th century Spain, the olla podrida represented the culinary taste of nobles, both for its ostentation and its opulence. Yet everyone, from kings to canons, rectors to peasants, enjoyed it. And although its beginnings as a simpler stew with humbler ingredients is generally agreed upon, no one really knows its point of origin. Some postulate that it was originally Gallic or perhaps Visigoth. Others theorize, and many others theorize, that it came from the Jewish avafina, a stew prepared on Fridays to avoid cooking on the Sabbath. And this one I just learned recently and is compelling and exciting for me. The Spanish recipe bears a striking resemblance to the recipe on cooking a dish called sinhaji from Ibn Racine's Fudalat manuscript from the 13th century. At each table, ingredients for the stew would invariably change depending on area, season, economic level of those cooking, but in the 16th century, it becomes the fashion among the aristocracy, and for 3 centuries is served from the richest tables to the poorest. Recipes would vary from one cook to the next, but all agreed that the recipes may be many and varied. Scapi is the first to ever publish a recipe olla podrida. We can find things like in the 13th century recipes similar to, but called olla podrida. This is the first one. And he opens it by explaining the very name of the dish. And he says here, this preparation, olla podrida, is named thus by Spaniards because it is made mostly in earthenware stew pots called ollas, and podrite means a variety of well-cooked ingredients. He then goes on to enumerate the quantities of pork, beef, fowl, legumes, vegetables, grains, and spices that are combined to make this stew. In total, there are 7 different pork products, 5 beef, goat, and domestic fowl, 6 different wild birds, including 20 thrush and 20 quail, 12 vegetables and legumes, and 3 different types of seasoning. His detail to presentation is also exceptional as he explains how to present the meals in a series of layers over different platters, allowing time for each layer to rest and a final addition of spices before serving. And again, I think I'll just not read this, but you can get a sense here of his sense of how he wants to present the dish. Another olla podrida recipe appears in the 16th century Hungarian cookbook, The Science of Cooking. While much shorter than Scapi's, this recipe also includes pork, beef, and a wide variety of poultry. And I will quickly read this one. I didn't put it up on the screen, but it says, boil the pig's leg, then some beef, sausage, and liver, and 10 kinds of bird meat if you can have it. Cook them all in one pot and begin it with the older animals, then the younger ones. Add some salt, red cabbage, carrot, wild carrot. Mix them together with meat, then pour boiled beef broth onto it. Add some salt and pepper, saffron and ginger. Serve it once cooked. One notes here the insistence of cooking the older animals first, a clear reminder of the time needed to make the meat more tender. The author finishes his recipe for olla podrida with the following statement. He says, "The dish is cooked twice or thrice a year for the Holy Roman Emperor." Again, we find connections between the dish and royalty. Almost 30 years later, Diego Granado copies this recipe and many of Scapi when he publishes Libro del Arte de Cocina in 1599, and as a result is the first published recipe of olla podrida in its native country. Granado naturally eliminates the explanation of the name that opens Scapi's version, and he also edits out some seasonal suggestions offered at the end, but essentially it remains identical to Scapi's. While Granado's cookbook brings to Spain the creative cooking found among the pages of Scapi's work, the 1611 publication of Martinez Montiño's cookbook completely overshadows Granado's, which left little mark on Spanish culinary development and was not published again until the late into the 20th century. All right, here we go. Question number 3. Have you tried olla podrida or its modern counterpart cocido? And what personal or cultural connections do you associate with that experience? As with so many cooks of the early modern period, little is known about Martinez Montiño's life. Possibly Galician, worked his entire life in kitchens. He began as a humble kitchen boy and moved his way up to master cook for Philip III and IV. In his opening prologue, he alludes to having served in the kitchen of Philip II's sister, Doña Juana, in Portugal. And historian Pere Samper notes that he then moved to the royal kitchens in Madrid and began serving Philip III in 1585, where he worked for Philip III and then Philip IV, either until his retirement or his death in 1629. Martinez Montiño's work is recognized as the most published Spanish cookbook before the 20th century, with at least 28 editions known to scholars today. It's separated into 2 chapters, the first with cleanliness of kitchen and staff, also how to serve banquets and suggested banquet menus, and then the second, the bulk of it, is 506 recipes organized, much as the title suggests, into sections of cooking, pies, pastries, and preserves. Martinez Montiño shares many recipes with Granado, including regional and international dishes. Both include ingredients and recipes that reflect Spain's Hispano-Muslim past. Internationally, Granado obviously has more Italian recipes because he's taken them all from Scapi, and Martinez Montiño, French and Portuguese. They also share a similar sense of herb and seasoning, a consciousness of varying cooking temperatures, and a wide range of cooking verbs. By the time Martinez Montiño publishes his cookbook, the olla podrida is already firmly established in the culinary culture of Spain, as evidenced by its appearance in the works of numerous fiction writers. Martinez Montiño puts his own signature on this classic recipe when he includes una olla podrida en pastel as part of his collected recipes. Like Scapi and Granado, he includes a wide variety of pork, beef, fowl, legumes, and vegetables, and he cooks them separately and produces an excellent broth in which he then stews the vegetables. And again, you know, I don't have to read this whole thing, but it will give you a sense of what's included here and then how he combines the stock used for the 2 meat pots to then cook the vegetables. So his unique approach is then that he uses these many and varied ingredients as a filling for a pie. Once the ingredients are cooked, he explains how to assemble and bake the pie. He calls for a thick, dark crust made from either rye or whole wheat, and layers the ingredients that have been previously separated out and seasons them with a mixture of clove, nutmeg, black pepper, saffron, ginger, and caraway. When the pie is half baked, he then injects stock into it and then lets it finish baking. Like Scapi's recipe, Martinez Montiño is opulent and crafted for the most wealthy. Within Spain, other versions of the dish appear in more modest cookbooks, like the Libro de Arte de Cocina by Domingo Hernández de Maceras, who was cook in a resident hall at the University of Salamanca, he presents a significantly more modest version of the dish, although it too contains all types of animal products, garbanzos, garlic, turnips, and seasoning. This dish that's key to Spain's culinary history continues to appear over 200 years later. It shows up in La Cocina de los Jesuitas. And in this much reduced version, the author explains that it is a meal to be consumed on regular or non-abstinence days. Outside of Spain, the olla podrida rapidly becomes one of Spain's rich gastronomic contributions to Europe. Between the time of Diego Granado and Martinez Montiño, 1599 to 1611, versions begin to appear across Europe. For example, in the 1604 cookbook, Ouvetoir de Cuisine by Lancelot du Casteau, he has an olla podrida in his cookbook, and his recipe is even more extravagant than Scappi's. It begins with beef, chicken, mutton, and duck, and then he adds numerous other meats, poultry, and vegetables, including raviolis filled with almond and candied quince. The platters are finished with a dozen feet of sheep, well washed, put around the plate, and are decorated with cooked dates between each of the feet. Only a few years later, in 1612, Antonius Magirus publishes this cookbook, and in there writes a lengthy version of the recipe. The translation of this is something like cookery book or familiar kitchen book suited to all young women who want to understand the workings of the kitchen or how to bake pies and tarts. And what's interesting about this, critics Schilderman and Sells have pointed out that he substitutes ingredients that were available to the Dutch. As noted by its subtitle, the shift from royalty to familiar kitchens is clear. Additionally, historian Deborah Krohn notes that this cookbook project appeals, quote, to bourgeois women who could presumably learn both general things like the workings of the kitchen and more specific instructions regarding the creation of particular dishes. Similar to Martinez Montiño, who writes recipes for men and women cooking both in royal kitchens and in private homes, it's clear that this Spanish recipe has appealed to a wide audience. Attempting to adapt recipes from abroad to conform to the availability and taste of specific locale is again present in Gervais Markham's 1615 English version that appears in his cookbook, The English Housewife. While elements of the Spanish recipe are recognizable in his version, for example, the many meats, poultries, and vegetable selections, Markham, like Du Casteau and Magirus before him, includes ingredients that differ from the Spanish version. Tubers like potato roots and skirret, and leaf vegetables like strawberry leaves, succory, and marigold leaves. In the explanation of its presentation, he includes Spanish dishware and layers of fruit, seen also in the French version, and we'll put up on screen here. This dish it up upon great chargers or long Spanish dishes made in the fashion of our English wooden trays with great stores of sippets in the bottom. Then cover the meat all over with prunes, raisins, currants, and blanched almonds, boiled in a thing by themselves. Then cover the fruit and the whole boiled herbs with slices of oranges and lemons, and lay the roots round about the sides of the dish, and strew good store of sugar all over, and so serve it forth. Again in 1660, Robert May opens his cookbook, The Accomplished Cook, with the recipe to make an olla podrida, showing once again the importance of the dish for the British. Returning to Italy, the German-born Mattia Hager published a 1623 treatise on serving called Lo Scalco, in which he illustrates how to serve the olla podrida. This is such a beautiful illustration here. So for these instructions, he includes a table map with the olla podrida as the centerpiece, surrounded by different meat dishes. Jaeger organizes dishes to be served seasonally and places the olla podrida as a third course among those served in winter. He writes, "It is a Spanish-style dish in which various things are included, such as quail, thrush, squab, partridge, capon, chicken, veal, ox, and boar, regular sausages, big sausages, ham, tongue, pig's feet and face, cabbage, turnips, fennel, broad beans, spices, and other ingredients." Okay. So in addition to cookbook citations of the olla podrida as an excellent Spanish dish, European travelers to Spain repeatedly note its unique and excellent quality. In 1669, Samuel Pepys writes in his journal of an olio, his term for the olla podrida, that was prepared by a cook who had spent time in Spain. Oh, thought I had a, I guess I don't have that, sorry. He writes, yeah. Sorry, 1 second. I feel like I missed a little part. Okay, we'll keep going. He writes, shares is to treat us with a Spanish olio by a cook of his acquaintance that is there, that was with my lord in Spain, and without any other company, he did do it, and mighty nobly. And the olio was indeed a noble dish, such as I never saw before or any more of. And in James Howell's letter to Lady Cornwallis, he calls the dish the Reverend Matron and compares it to a living being with mutton, beef, and bacon as her soul, cabbage, turnips, artichokes, potatoes, and dates as the five senses, and pepper as her common sense. So we can see that not only in cookbooks, but in personal narratives, writers include a sense of admiration for what they describe as an extravagant Spanish dish. By examining cookbooks throughout Europe, we can trace the rise of the Spanish national dish from its first recorded beginnings in the 16th century to its honored place on the Spanish table in the 17th century. We can also begin to get a sense of how famous cooks, historians, and gastronomes recognize the olla podrida as the definitive Spanish contribution within European gastronomy. Today, the olla podrida has evolved into the cocido. Its rich regional variances give unique qualities to what is still a meat, bean, and vegetable one-pot delight. The dish is typically eaten in 3 courses: meat-based broth with noodles, garbanzos and cabbage, and a variety of meats, pork, beef, fowl, typically the cocido madrileño, the puchero andaluz, escudella catalana, cocido de Murcia, cocido montañés, cocido maragato de Asturias are some of the regional varieties that come from this early modern tradition. The interest in Spanish court cuisine culminates in a French cookbook authored by Pierre de Lune, published in 1662 in Paris, that contains almost 200 recipes. I'll do the English translation of the title, which is "The New and Perfect Chief Royal Butler Teaching the Way to set tables on ordinary days and holidays, as much for meat as for fish, following the 4 seasons of the year." All of this, depicted by many illustrations, together constitutes a new Spanish cookbook containing a new way to prepare all sorts of dishes, such as meat and fish, in a very enjoyable way. Little is known of de Lune. Spanish historians propose that he is Spanish, probably from Aragon or Valencia. He was cook in the house of the Duc de Rohan before serving the English princess and Duchess of Orleans, Henrietta Ann Stewart. And prior to this cookbook, he published another one, Les Cuisiniers, that is recognized as the first cookbook published in France that treats in detail how to serve courses. But it is this second publication that holds particular relevance to understanding European perspectives on Spanish cuisine. In it, he describes in detail the oversight of food preparation and its service throughout the seasons, and in addition provides an entire treatise on Spanish cooking. This part of the cookbook is divided into 5 sections: fat and lean soups, 64 recipes, and then meat, roasts, pastries, and fish. In his prologue, he communicates his passion for the culinary arts and specifically for the contributions of Spanish gastronomy. Yeah, and so I'll read this part in English. You will also see a new Spanish cookbook in which appears a way of preparing all sorts of dishes, as much meat as fish and other delectables, using an all-new method not yet seen in other publications, which will undoubtedly be most pleasing to all sorts of people. So the presence here of Spanish influences is transmitted on several levels. The first and most obviously are the almost 3 dozen recipes that include Spanish in the title, and I think I put up a bunch of them there. Of these, some include ingredients found only in France. For example, in the potage de chapeau à l'espagnol, the Spanish capon soup, it calls for prune du Brugnol. So you're not going to get them outside of Brugnol. And other recipes include specific Spanish ingredients, like in Autre potage de chapeau, another capon soup, he begins cook Spanish cardoons and emphasizes the Spanish. Still, other recipes provide commentaries for cooks unfamiliar with Spanish cuisine. So in the first recipe of the collection, potage de santé, healthy soup, he begins with the explanation with the following, and he says, in order to make it well, put a capon in a pot with a veal sweetbread, even though it is rare in this country, and cook it with water. So here he reassures his readers of the unfamiliar procedure. And in his potage de pois au porré, he again, Delun's recipe again accommodates differences of cultural norms for those who write the recipe and for those who will prepare it. And he says in this one, this is made the same way as the French, except you can add currants, pine nuts, oils, capers, and saffron. So finally, Delun also includes recipes for other geographical destinations that are favored by Spaniards. So in one recipe called Genovese pasta soup, called vermigui in the Genovese language, Delun explains its inclusion. And he says, this soup is highly esteemed by the Spaniard, as are all the other pastas from Genoa. As is made clear with these examples, Delun's project not only shares Spanish recipes with his French audience, but also explains what foods and flavors Spaniards value. So curiously, he does not include the olla podrida among his selections, but his rich collection of Spanish soups and stews, his poultry, beef, pork, and seafood dishes, pâtés, sausages, and pies, written for cooks working in the French court and among its aristocracy, is a powerful testament to how Spanish cuisine was valued beyond the borders of its own country. As the 17th century drew to a close, cultural shifts followed political trends, and Spanish influences across Europe waned as French cultural hegemony began to take shape. In the world of gastronomic arts, the creative forces of the French chef La Varenne, who was a contemporary of Delun's, and later Carême and Escoffier, would gain the attention of both Spain and the rest of Europe. But before that shift in Italian gastronomy took hold, the works of Nola and Martinez Montino provide us with evidence of which dishes from Spain were valued among the early modern aristocracy and which dishes endured the test of time. Voices beyond the borders of Spain, Scapi, de Casteau, Majerus, Markham, Delun, and others provide evidence of how early modern Spanish cuisine was perceived and valued throughout Europe, and what role the olla podrida played in shaping Spanish cuisine. So I'm closing out with my fourth and final question. Now that you've considered a national cuisine dish or food item, how do you think others perceive your national cuisine? And does it differ from your own perception? And that's it. For joining me this afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much. And I hope you can hear me. I know my connection has been really spotty today, so I'm sorry if it's not clear for people, but thank you so much for that talk and for your questions. And I am happy to ask any questions or comments that anyone who has listened to the talk might have, as long as I can stay connected.
And can I also add, Michelle, that I'm very interested in hearing some of the responses to those questions about notions of national cuisine and connections with Olla podrida, if people are willing to share.
I have. I'll keep my eye on the chat if anyone has a response. I have when I lived in with a family in Sevilla in the 80s, they made the best cocidos. It really was, you know, and I got it was very hard back then to find cookbooks of that, but I have a potajes y cocidos that I got very cheaply, like at a kiosco, at a, you know, a street stand where they sell newspapers, and I still use that to make sort of cocidos, which it sounds like are maybe distant cousins of the olla podrida. I can't imagine all the money that went into preparing something like that. Your description of all those meats sounds really incredible.
That for me is one of those crazy things, because it can be that intense, but it can also be very humble. It can be a very humble meal, right? So what, for me, one of the fascinating things about this dish, one is that it really has survived. And I think external to Spain, people today don't know about it as much unless they go to Spain, not like the paella or the gazpacho, right?
Yeah.
That it still lives at all levels of society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about paella, and I was also thinking about couscous in Morocco. You know, and the way couscous is really identified with Moroccan cuisine, and it's considered something you have to plan, and if you visit, it's very much hyped as this is our cuisine. But I have a question from Matt Deasing in the audience, and he thanks you for the really fascinating talk. But he wanted to know more about that dish you mentioned at the beginning from Ceuta.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put that in the. Can people see it if I put it in the chat here? Yeah, okay. This is the title of it, and let me see if I can get a page number for you. It's on page 65 of La Cocina Hispano-Maghrebi. So you can look it up there. Again, this is an edition I think Manuela Marin put out in the early 2000s, 90s maybe, I'm not sure when. But it's a wonderful cookbook and just filled with really great recipes. And again, gives you the nice connections between, you know, East and West, what's happening in Southern Spain and Northern Africa. And it's pretty cool. It's interesting to me to see the difference of the trajectories. Like I mentioned in the talk, in these two 13th century texts, it's more than common to talk about regional products and even specific people. And, you know, in the early part, like the Sensovi itself is anonymous, right? It was such a humble thing. You don't even mention who you are writing this. So it's just two different approaches, right, to records of food history. I guess that we, as like the European side, take a while to get caught up to, oh, maybe we should include our names and acknowledge our sources.
Right, when you can find them. Because I know working in cookbooks, I mean, you've done this great job of mapping out how different authors attribute dishes to different nationalities or different geographic places or cultures. But you know, are those, I don't know, do you find that that's always correct? Or it seems like sometimes they may attribute it to some, you know, to a particular group, and you may know it from another group, and it seems
yeah, I love your line of thinking there, because you know, how do we really know, and how do we value those opinions of, like, you know, from the outside, right? And our recording in the Markham, the cookbook that I quoted, he's pretty disparaging about Spain in general. He includes that, but he makes a couple comments that aren't really positive about Spanish cooking. So, what do you do with those kind of interpretations? Or the different ones that I cited are very intentional about including ingredients available to them. Like, what's the point of including a recipe if you don't have the ingredients to make it? So yeah, I like thinking about those. It just brings us back to today, like the 21st century, and like, what is the knowledge and what is the value of these different perspectives on discussing, a certain issue.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's always interesting to think about how people use food. And the questions you asked asked us to think about during your talk, but how people perceive their own food ways or their own food tradition identities, and how other people think of those food identities. Let's see. So we have a couple comments. Kristen DeAngelis notes that rosewater is a beautiful ingredient, and has had a dessert with rosewater that from her Polish grandmother. And then I think you can read them, but I'll read them as well. And Martha Doss mentions her Palestinian grandmother who also used rosewater. So there you have this ingredient that someone may identify as being Andalusi. I always think of it as Andalusi. And then you have someone whose Polish grandmother used the same ingredient. And Sarah Gardner mentions her experience with the olla podrida is actually more an experience with adafina, which you mentioned the relationship in your talk. And the first adafina that Sarah had was in the Jewish community of Madrid. And one of the community members was crypto-Jewish, and had lamb cocido, totally kosher lamb cocido recipe in the cookbook. So that's the comment. And then the question is, I wonder if you'd be able to talk more about the Jewish connection of this dish.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. Actually, Michelle and I were talking about Jewish contributions to really cuisine across the Iberian Peninsula, and how hard it is to nail that down. So one thing I wanted to share with you is the connections between the Hispano-Muslim cookbooks, the 13th century ones, where there are in the titles built-in Jewish references. So it was pretty cool to do a study of those 5 recipes to see what their commonalities were and what differences there might have been with other recipes. Say, for example, partridge. There's like a Jewish style partridge. Well, how does that differ from the other partridge recipes? I actually had in this talk some references to Jewish influences, especially with Nola. I'm exploring connections there, but it's really hard to find concrete evidence. And so I ended up in the end just taking it out because I just didn't feel comfortable enough with saying, oh, it's definitely there. But that's my intuition, that he is, of all of the writers, well, and Martinez Montino, sensitive to diets from Jewish and Muslim communities. So I always keep my eye out for people working on that. But yeah, it's tricky territory. What are your thoughts?
Well, my sort of area of focus is the culinary heritage and cultural identity of Sephardic Jews. And I wrote a paper a while ago for a conference about kind of what I felt like was the hidden Jewish history of cocido. I think in a lot of ways, even later, you see like people like Emilia Pardo Bazán and these like 19th century like social critics who also have food, who are doing food criticism. Also, they keep going back to like the Greco-Roman history of the peninsula and this dish, and it like totally like it's this weird circumvention of the definite Muslim influences there, but and also to me the Jewish influences, because you do see adafina and hameen in its various iterations throughout the Iberian Peninsula before expulsion and then after, like wherever. I was also struck in your talk the different places you listed after, like France and the Netherlands. Those were all places where Sephardic Jews ended up settling to. And so I have a similar sort of like instinct where I'm like, this feels to me like there's something there, but you're right. It's so hard to actually prove with like written records, but it is also a hunch that I have very much.
I know, and you just have to be so careful of that. I'll tell you, it's switching gears a little bit, but the background of Martinez Montiño himself, people are constantly saying he's from Galicia, and he very well might be. But there was a paper presented recently, and in the first few editions of the cookbook, his name doesn't include Montiño at all. That kind of comes after his death, and he's so anyhow. I just have to question: is he really from Galicia or not? And I'm not arguing one way or the other, but I just don't want to accept that as fact when I don't see that clear line. And so same with the Adafina, you see that all over the place. Oh, the Olla podrida comes from the Adafina. And yeah, that's a great theory. But the one for me that was interesting was recently finding the connection with the 13th century Hispano-Muslim cookbook. And so again, was that Jewish influence there? Was it just a commingling of the two? So exciting kind of treasure hunt, right? Like,
Totally, yeah. And thanks so much for the response.
All right. Well, I have one other comment, and I'm not sure who it's from because it just says iPhone in the chat, but it is a comment that the person always thought that cozido was Portuguese, right? And a Sunday lunch dish. Again, sort of thinking in the Iberian frame, I think.
Yeah, is that something from centuries before or today, that connection with the word cocido and like I'm asking the person who wrote the comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure who it is, so maybe they can pipe back in. Yeah, exactly. Or let us know.
Oh, it's today. It's a very typical dish. You find it all over Portugal, and the day to eat it is Sunday. But it was not until a few years ago that I ate it in Galicia, and it's the same thing, cocido. But I never knew that it was prevalent in Spain, and that it had this very, very interesting and complex history. Nor did I ever see it connected with Olla podrida.
Well,
thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll look at that one, the manual that comes, the 15th century women's manual that comes out of the court of Portugal, to see if there's a recipe in there for it. That would be interesting too. I haven't seen that yet, but I also looked closely.
Yeah. It's very simple. It's a very, very simple thing to make.
Yeah.
Just a matter of assembling all the meats and sausages and vegetables and yeah.
Can I ask others too? I'm interested in this idea that it's really connected to a specific day of the week, really kind of this, so in the Christian community, right, this day of rest. So again, it goes back to that sort of notion about something prepared the day before that could be eaten that day. And is that true in other parts of Spain? Do you associate cocido today with a specific day of the week?
In my experience of it in Spain, it was definitely a Sunday dish, which is also for me why it has a lot of parallelism in the Jewish tradition. It's sort of like you scoot it over a day, right? Because Adafina was made on Friday night for Saturday, and it was typically eaten as the Seder Shlishit, the like third meal of the day after services. And so, I mean, just to continue the line of logic of that hunch, but to answer your question, in my experience, it's definitely like a Sunday sit down, everybody's at the table kind of meal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone else is going to respond about day of the week, but I know Emily Colbert had a question, well, a comment. Thank you for the talk, and the fact that she always thought of the olla podrida as a peasant dish. So this has really changed the way she's thinking about it. And then that, I think, led to the question of, do you think it would have been more important, the olla podrida, than a poultry dish without stew for the elite if they wanted to show off or impress at a meal? Yeah, because it's very impressive the way you describe it with all the meats in it.
Yeah, Emily, that's a great question. I'm not sure. You know, of course, the olla podrida was one that was broken out over courses, and then the poultry was, you know, recognized as sort of one of those peak moments in the meal. Although you had different poultry courses throughout as well. I mean, different kinds of poultry dishes throughout the different courses. So I like your question, but I'm not quite sure how to answer it. Yeah.
Let's see. Well, we're already at past 5. So I think at this point we could wrap things up, and thank you for this wonderful talk, and also for entertaining all of our questions and comments. It's been really wonderful to hear from you. I hope you can hear me. I have this feeling like I'm breaking up constantly, but it was a wonderful talk, and I can't thank you enough. And I'm just delighted that you could join us today.
Well, me too, and thanks everyone for taking time. I know the Zoom weariness. We're all in the middle of it, in the middle of the semester, so I really appreciate everyone coming out and attending. So,
Yeah. All right. Applauso. Thank you. I'll keep it on. I know some comments are coming in, so I'll let. I know it does make me hungry when I hear the talks, and then I wish I had some savory meats that were stewed with nuts and spices
Thank you, Carolyn.
and cinnamon.
Thank you, Carolyn. Great talk.
Hola, Isidro.
Hola.
Encantada.
Yeah.
Gracias por la invitación. And this
Muy
is
bien, estupendo. Tengo hambre, tengo hambre.
well, this is the biggest setback for me of the COVID era. You know, how great it would be for all of us to go out now and have drinks and a meal and, you know, talk, and it's just not the same. It's not the same as the quarantine is not quite the same as the meal in person.
Yeah. Yeah, we traditionally have had a reception and then a dinner afterwards. So yeah, it isn't the same. Being able to have that sort of spontaneous conversation and then reflect over drinks and a meal.
Yeah.
Although we do have a food group. We have a food group here in Minnesota, and we're going to debrief after your talk with copas or tea or whatever, once we can recharge and sort of, discuss food things.
Do you all ever recreate, you know, recipes from different time periods?
Yeah, before COVID, we did. We had we each picked a dish from, you know, our own sort of time period and geographic area that we were working in, and I made albondigas from the almohad cook, and that was fun. And you know, someone who works in, I think, archaeology in Ireland, made some, if I remember correctly, they may be on and correct me, but made some great bread. And then I think brought a type of cheese that kind of reflected, you know, very early, I don't know, archaeological. Yeah, I mean, so we had a great variety of dishes. It was fun. Do you do that with like, I don't know, a research group or with students? Is that?
Yeah, actually, we have a group of friends. I call them the Royal Tasters, because I'm working on that translation and critical edition of Martinez Montino's cookbook. Like, I've been doing this for way too many years. Like, I gotta get that thing out. But in the process, like, I'll be reading a recipe, I'm like, oh my God, I gotta try this. So I've recreated tons of those. And sometimes I'll do like a whole meal, and then I'll have my friends over and say, okay, you gotta give me feedback, you know. And so we just laugh, and And again, we call ourselves the royal tasters. So
Oh, that's a great idea. I know, because sometimes it's very hard because, measurements aren't there, or, or it's very loose, suggestions. And then you're trying to figure out, what pot do I use? Or what does this mean? Like, yeah. But it's fun. All right. Well, I will let you go. I know, post talk, but yeah. So, next year, inshallah, tocar madera. Hopefully, we can connect at a conference or somewhere.
that'll be great. Thanks again, both to you and Isidro, for the invitation.
All right. Ciao.